I had spent all 82 years of my life within these walls, this vast time-worn house that had long since become an extension of my own body. I thought I knew every corner of it, from the forgotten relics in the attic to the exact floorboards that would creak beneath my feet. But I was wrong, terribly wrong. This house, my refuge, my sanctuary, had been guarding, deep within its untouched foundations, a secret so immense that even I, its most faithful inhabitant, had no inkling of its existence. Had it not been for that cruel twist of fate, that unfortunate leak dripping from the ceiling, forcing me to venture into the gloom of the accursed cellar, the burden hidden within these walls, this locked silence, might have remained buried forever beneath the damp tranquility of the earth.
The veil of this mystery began to lift on that gray day, when the heavens seemed to split open and a dreadful storm descended upon the town like a curse. As the roaring wind shook the windows and the rain beat against the panes with furious insistence, my thoughts were fixed only on whether this old house, the very one my late husband Henry had once built with such pride, declaring, "This is our fortress, Nora, no storm shall ever bring it down," could withstand this new and violent trial. At first, I paid little attention to the small leak that appeared in the far corner of the kitchen ceiling, just a timid drip falling in rhythm into a tin bucket. Yet, as I traced the damp stains spreading along the plaster, I realized with a growing unease that its source lay within the oldest and thickest wall of the house, the very one through which the main water pipes descended towards the cellar. It became clear that I had no choice but to venture down into that dismal place, the cellar I normally entered only to store my preserves and sacks of potatoes. That cold, airless chamber, whose heavy smell of mildew and damp earth had always reminded me of a grave. Taking the large, weighty torch in hand, I descended the creaking wooden steps one by one. The beam of light, though bright, failed to pierce the darkness fully. It merely glided across the shapes of old furniture, shrouded in dusty white sheets, like forgotten corpses wrapped for burial, and stirred ghostly shadows that danced restlessly upon the walls. My focus was entirely on the dripping sound above and the slick wetness of the walls as I tried to trace the leak's origin. Then, for the briefest of moments, the trembling light of my torch caught something in the farthest corner, behind the old coal store, a low, uneven bulge, clumsily concealed beneath a rotting tarpaulin I had never noticed before, or perhaps had long forgotten. For a moment, the entire cellar seemed to fall silent. Only the faint dripping of water and the quickening of my breath remained. When the beam illuminated the intricate carvings barely visible beneath layers of mud and mold, I realized with a chill that it was no ordinary object, but a chest, ancient, solid, and bound with rusted iron corners, half consumed by the dampness of the earth itself. As I reached out with trembling fingers towards the spot where the torchlight rested, what I felt was not merely the clammy, rough texture of the wood, but its immovable weight, as though it had grown roots into the ground, deliberately and consciously buried beneath the packed soil. my gaze fixed on the heavy, blackened padlock that sealed the lid to its body, corroded and scarred by time, yet stubbornly whole, as if it defied decay itself. It looked as though it had been placed there not just to keep thieves at bay, but to guard whatever lay within from the reach of time and from eyes like mine. My mind could scarcely comprehend it. Henry and I had planned every brick, every beam of this house together, laying its foundations with our own hands. For something so mysterious, so ominous, to be hidden this close to its roots without my knowledge, defied all reason. Why would he conceal something so important from me, his wife, his confidant of a lifetime? The question struck me like a blade of ice. The rhythmic dripping from the ceiling now seemed distant, almost irrelevant, like a whisper from another world. The suffocating air of the cellar gave way to a burning, irresistible curiosity. Whatever lay buried in that silence, whatever secret had been so carefully hidden from me and the world, had now become the most urgent, the most inescapable, and perhaps the most dangerous matter of my 82 years of life.
When I threw my entire weight, not at the great chest, but onto that palm-sized, rusted lump of metal, my knuckles ached and writhed in pain, yet the accursed lock, fused to the wood as if it were one single thing, did not so much as budge. Its stubborn refusal to yield made it plain that this was no simple bolt. It had been placed to resist brute force. Holding the torch so close my eyes watered, I saw that it was not the sort of padlock you find in Henry's toolbox or hanging in the ironmonger's window. Beneath the crust of grime and rust, there was a carved emblem, an odd device like a family crest or an ancient seal, and the whole mechanism was antique and fiendishly intricate. The urgency of the leaking ceiling, indeed, why I was there at all, slipped to the back of my mind. All sought narrowed to one single aim: find something heavy and prying enough to prise this damn thing open. My hands began to hunt about the dusty old rack for a hammer, a chisel, anything that might lever this metal free, because the need to know what lay inside the chest had become a burning, blinding obsession that swallowed up reason. From the lowest shelf I hauled out a sledgehammer, its handle soft with rot and the wood clinging damply to my palm. I raised it as if I could vent every year of my life's anger into a single blow, and brought it down on the rusted lock with all my failing strength. The dull metallic clang echoed off the stone walls, but the only mark I achieved was a tiny, pitiful scratch. The lock simply sat there as if mocking my frailty. Gasping, sweat stinging my eyes, feeling the full weight of 82 years in my shoulders, I understood at last that brute force would not do. This contrivance had been conceived to withstand rudeness of hand and coarse violence.
It required instead a key, a single bespoke key hidden with the same deliberate cunning that had put the lock there in the first place. Most likely, I realized with a cold certainty, Henry himself had designed it and secreted that key somewhere in the house, perhaps in a place more secure than the chest. The sledgehammer slipped from my fingers and hit the damp earth with a muffled thud that felt like an accusation. As I moved the dim torch about the cellar, things that until that moment had seemed merely useless junk, Henry's old fishing gear, the stacked wooden boxes, the cracks in the wall, all of them sharpened into possibilities. Each could be a hiding place, each a secret hollow where one tiny metal piece might be concealed. The prospect of finding such a minute object among so much dust, detritus, and memory felt more desperate, more insane than trying to force the chest itself. Then my eye caught, down on the bottom shelf, Henry's battered blue toolbox. His paint was flaking, its edges tinged with rust, yet it seemed to have been put there with care. In life, he rarely opened it. When I once asked what was inside, he would brush me off with a laugh. "Not for you, Nora. Don't trouble yourself." Now the idea that this box might hold more than nails and screws, that it might contain the first clue to the key I sought, made my pulse drum. I crept forward as if disturbing a sleeping thing. The rusty clasp squealed when I lifted it, and the sound cut the cellar's silence like a knife. The cold smell of metal and machine oil that rose from the open lid felt more real than Henry's faded presence. I half believed this box might be the first door into the dark he'd kept from me. But when I tipped the torch inside, hope was doused with the chill certainty of disappointment. There was no key, no scrap of paper, only his old screwdrivers, oily handled and worn, a jumble of nuts and bolts, a few rusty nails, and a stinking, decayed tangle of rags. Still, realizing that the solution would not be so readily handed to me, I accepted that Henry had chosen a cunninger, more deliberate hiding place, and turned my light away from the toolbox to search the cellar's other likely refuges.
When I closed the lid of Henry's rusted blue toolbox, the sound seemed to echo through me, the dull thud of resignation. I knew then, bitterly, that this was no simple mystery to be solved with brute persistence. Henry would never have made so amateurish a mistake as to leave a key tucked among his tools. The man who buried that chest had planned every detail with a precision that bordered on obsession. I began to move the torchlight over the damp, moss-clad stone foundations of the cellar, not in search of a key any longer, but for a clue, a flaw, an irregularity. And then I saw it. A single brick to the left of the stairwell, neater cut than the rest, its mortar crumbling, its edges too smooth, as though it had been added later, a foreign intruder among the old stones. Ignoring the ache of 82 years in my bones, I sank to my knees and ran trembling fingers along the brick's edge.
Unlike the rough, clammy texture of its neighbors, this one felt smoother, oddly deliberate. Then my fingertips brushed against a faint hollow at the top, a fine, almost invisible seam, and my heart began to pound so hard I feared it might break through my ribs. Snatching the rusted chisel from Henry's toolbox, I pressed its tip into the slender gap, not with brute force, but with the careful patience of someone handling something sacred. At first, the brick resisted. Then, with a slow, yielding sigh, it began to loosen, shifting grain by grain, until at last it came free beneath my hands. When I lifted it away and set it gently on the damp earth, the torchlight revealed a hollow space carved neatly into the wall. Narrow, perfectly measured, large enough for a single hand. Inside, wrapped tightly in what looked like an oiled cloth to keep the damp at bay, lay a small, palm-sized parcel. The torchlight could not pierce the full blackness of that cavity, now veiled in cobwebs and shadow. For a moment my hand hung in the air. The chill of the stone against my fingertips sent a shiver up my arm, a sharp, paralyzing hesitation that froze me where I knelt. I was about to reach into darkness that had not been touched for decades, darkness that might still bear the breath of Henry's secret. Holding my breath, I steadied my shaking hand and slid it into the crevice. My fingers brushed the slick, clammy surface of the oiled cloth, soft and strangely sticky. And at that instant, a jolt like cold electricity shot through me. I grasped the object firmly and drew it out swiftly, half expecting some venomous creature to leap from within. It was small enough to rest entirely in my palm, yet its weight, or rather its lightness, seemed to mock the gravity of what it might contain. The oiled cloth remarkably had preserved its strength despite decades of damp. When I held the torch close, I saw that the parcel was not merely wrapped, but bound, wound many times with a length of coarse, dry jute string, knotted with the patient precision of a sailor. Such meticulous care spoke of more than preservation. It was as though whoever had sealed it had wished to guard its contents not only from moisture and decay, but from time itself, and from prying hands like mine. Now there was no doubt in my mind this small, tightly bound parcel contained the key, the one thing that could unlock that great rusted padlock resting in the corner, and with it the hidden world Henry had kept from me all these years. The only question that remained was whether I had the courage to unwrap it, to see if it truly held the key I hoped for, or something far darker, something Henry had meant for me never to find. With those trembling, weakened fingers, the ones that old age and rheumatism had cruelly warped so that even threading a needle had become a trial, I wrestled with the knot Henry had tied, perhaps decades ago, with young, sure hands. Every second spent trying to loosen that stone-hard loop reminded me of my helplessness. My nails bent against the coarse fibers of the twine, and the knot seemed to mock the pathetic force of my attempts. When I admitted that my frail strength alone could not undo such meticulous binding, when I recognized, like a cold fact, that this too was part of the elaborate scheme my late husband had constructed to keep his secret safe, my gaze fell on the iron chisel I had used to prise out the brick.
It lay on the damp earth, its surface slick and cold. Summoning the last of my patience and forcing my hands to ignore the unpleasant bite of the metal against my skin, I slipped the chisel beneath the tight coils of jute and began, deliberately and with painstaking care, to cut, not with fury now, but with a quiet, surgical resolve. I severed the twine's stubborn strands one by one, slicing through the labor of years and the knot of my husband's will. When the final thread gave with a muffled, sharp snap, I drew a long, involuntary breath, feeling as if a weight had lifted. No bond now held me back. My fingers, shaky and eager as a child's, tore at the greasy layers of oiled cloth until the last protective film fell away. The torchlight revealed what I had hoped for and dreaded in equal measure. Nestled in my palm was a single iron key. Not like any door key I had ever seen, but an ornate, heavy instrument, cut with strange, sinuous engravings that the rust had not quite consumed. It looked crude and almost brutal in its form, yet somehow noble, utterly unlike anything this house or my life had previously yielded. The cold, gritty weight of it was more than physical. It carried with it the burden of the secret Henry had hidden from me, the unanswered prayers, the betrayals, perhaps, the dark destiny sealed in that chest in the corner of the cellar. Its mass sat in my hand like a promise and a threat all at once, an iron certainty that made my bones ache in sympathy. Suppressing the familiar ache in each joint with the rising tide of feverish excitement, I rose slowly from the damp floor. Clutching the key as if it were a living coal, I crossed the short stretch of cellar that felt, in those moments, like the length of a lifetime. The mud whispered beneath my feet, each step measured and monumental. I sank to my knees once more before the chest, ignoring the stab of pain in my aging joints. The fetid, earthy mold that rose from the rotting wood and swollen metal filled my lungs, a smell so dense it nearly took my breath, while the torchlight, glancing off the dented surface, made the old padlock look suddenly small and vulnerable beside the key I held. The very lock I had tried to batter earlier now seemed to await this exact moment, as if time had been circling toward this appointed moment. At that moment, my hand, the only link between the cold, rusted key in my grasp and the vast wooden chest waiting in the damp darkness, seemed to freeze, as if it no longer obeyed me. I knew that turning this key, breaking this long-sealed silence, would mean crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Whatever Henry had hidden, whatever truth he had buried so carefully, lay on the other side of that lock. and I sensed it might not just change my life, but destroy it. Then curiosity, fierce, unbearable, blazing, conquered the chill of hesitation. Gathering the last vestige of strength left to my 82-year-old frame, I threw my weight upon the key. At first, the mechanism refused me utterly. After decades of stillness, the cogs within had fused together under rust and time, resisting me like welded bone. The strain jolted up my arm till I feared my brittle wrist might snap. Just as despair began to overtake me, I twisted the key the other way, a desperate flick born of frustration, and then forced it back again with all the strength I possessed. From within the lock came a sound like the cracking of bone, a harsh, grinding shriek that tore through the cellar's suffocating stillness. It was the sound of time itself breaking. Then came the heavy final note, clank, deep, metallic, and absolute. The key turned freely in my palm. The massive shackle of the padlock, released at last, sprang open with sudden violence and struck the chest's body before swinging aside, as if an invisible hand had thrown it down. When I pulled the old lock from its corroded loop and laid it gently on the damp floor, the dull thud it made seemed to echo for an eternity. My eyes fixed on the thin, dark line where the lid of the chest met its base. No barrier now between me and what lay within. I slid my fingers into the narrow gap. The wood felt rough, swollen with years of moisture, and heavier than I had imagined. It resisted, not only with its own sodden weight, but with something else, as though the wood itself clung stubbornly to its secrecy. I pressed harder, summoning what remained of my strength, and the hinges screamed. It was a dreadful sound, long and ragged, the kind of tortured groan one might hear from a living creature in pain. The death cry of the silence that had guarded this box for decades. At last, with a final shuddering creak, the lid gave way and fell back, striking the wall behind it. For the first time in who knew how many years, the air within the chest met the air of the cellar. What burst forth was not the smell of rot or mold, but something far sharper, the dry, stinging scent of camphor and lavender, the paper-dry perfume of the past. I coughed as the acrid air caught my throat and lifted the torch. The beam trembled across the interior, and what it revealed was no glint of treasure, no horror of bone or decay, but a dark shape swathed in thick gray dust. A heavy piece of velvet lay spread across the contents, so black it seemed to swallow the light. There was nothing now between me and the secret Henry had buried beneath this house, beneath our life. No lock, no barrier, no pretense of ignorance. I could feel the pull of it, that mixture of terror and rapture that makes the blood sing, drawing me toward the velvet shroud. My hand rose of its own accord. I was powerless to resist. The tips of my fingers brushed the velvet that covered the mysterious heap inside the chest, a strange fabric, at once soft to the touch, yet hardened by years of damp and decay. As I disturbed it, a heavy cloud of dust rose into the air, thick with a biting scent of mothballs and dried flowers. I recoiled, coughing, the breath stolen from me by the weight of the past. This was no mere cloth, it was a shroud, a veil drawn across memory itself. Summoning every ounce of courage, I gripped the rough edge of the fabric with both hands and began to draw it back slowly, as though afraid that any sudden movement might harm whatever secret lay beneath. The material resisted me. It felt far heavier than it should, as though weighted with lead, unwilling to surrender the mystery it protected. For a moment, it seemed to fight me, the last sentinel between me and the truth. Then, with a long sigh, like the exhalation of an old spirit, the velvet yielded. It folded back in soft, defeated waves, and my trembling torchlight fell into the heart of the chest. What it revealed was not chaos, not some haphazard hoard of relics, but order, meticulous, deliberate order. There lay neat bundles of yellowed papers tied with faded ribbons, their corners curled with age. Scattered old photographs, and at the center of it all, a thick, leather-bound book, its cover darkened with time. I flung the discarded cloth aside, letting it slump onto the damp earth, and the chest's upper layer, Henry's secret methodical world, stood bare before me. It was no treasure chest, but an archive, a vault of remembrance, carefully arranged, sealed, and perhaps meant never to be disturbed again. My gaze ignored the ribbons and the photographs. It fixed upon the book, the one that ruled over all the rest, resting like a monarch among its courtiers. Its leather cover was cracked, its stitching frayed, the corners crushed, yet it retained a grave dignity. Though it bore no lock, its mere presence seemed to radiate secrecy. I knew without question that this silent, nameless volume was where my search must begin. When my fingers touched it, the leather was cold, damp, and unnervingly smooth, like the skin of something once living. I flinched, and for a heartbeat, fought the urge to withdraw my hand. Every instinct warned me that opening this book would change something irreversibly. At last, trembling, I lifted it out from among the papers and brought it under the flickering torchlight. Its cover was blank, utterly blank. No name, no date, no inscription, no mark of identity at all. The emptiness of it made it somehow more sinister, more deliberate, as though its silence was part of the message. Half expecting to find a clasp, a lock, even a buckle, I ran my fingers along its swollen edges, searching for resistance. There was none. Henry had left no physical barrier to guard this relic.
Its only lock was its own stillness. Now only the sealed pages themselves stood between me and whatever he had buried here. I slid the edge of my thumbnail, sharp and trembling, between the stiff leather cover and the first yellowed sheet, forcing it gently apart as though I were cutting open a wound. My heartbeat thundered so loudly that I realized I was no longer breathing. And then, as the cover yielded with a long, sorrowful creak, the sigh of damp paper parting after years of silence, the torchlight fell across the first page. There were no faint pencil marks, no drafts of a man's hand. Instead, written in dark, confident ink, in a neat, elegant script unmistakably belonging to a woman and entirely unknown to me, were the first words of whatever truth Henry had gone to such lengths to conceal.
As the torch's wavering beam played across that rough, damp page, the neat, pearl-like letters revealed themselves to be no crude scrawl of Henry's hurried, doctor-like hand. They were utterly unlike him, precise, practiced, a woman's hand, written with an elegance and discipline I had never seen in my life. The realization hit me with a coldness that seeped into my bones. This was not the idle scribble of some passing thought, but the deliberate script of a stranger, a woman I had never met and never even known to exist. A chill more terrible than the cellar's cold began to spread through my chest, the cold of betrayal, or perhaps of sacrifice. Bringing the torch so close that the light almost touched the paper, I saw how black the ink still sat, how painstakingly each character had been formed, not a hurried note, but a weighty, deliberate text written with obsessive care. The letters leaned with the imperfect grace of a calligrapher's hand, each stroke measured as if performing a ritual. Even in my stunned state, I understood that this was no casual entry. It was a document composed with great affection or else with an equally great malice. My eyes fought the dim blur of the cellar and fixed on the top corner of the page, where journals and ledger entries begin. There, stubbornly legible beneath the torchlight, was a date. It was impossible. 15 years before I had married Henry? 15 years before our first meeting? A time when I was still a young woman in the town and he was a stranger whose name I had not even heard? Beneath that impossible date, in the same uncompromising hand, was the first brief sentence, a line so cold it seemed to stop the blood in my veins. Exchange completed. The entrusted item is secure. I read those words aloud in my head as if translating a foreign tongue, and they meant nothing and everything at once. What was this exchange? Who or what was the entrusted thing? How could this possibly tie to my life, to this house, to Henry's secret? Until that instant, I had imagined the chest would conceal small worldly sins, passion letters, hidden deeds, and unpaid debt. Now the book in my hands was an index into a far darker, more complex history, a history of Henry long before he was my husband, a nightmarish tangle I had not known existed. The truth landed on me like a slab of ice. There in the cold, damp cellar, with only the rhythmic drip from the ceiling for company, Those two words, exchange and entrusted, echoed and echoed, detonating the foundations of the 50 years I had believed were built on love and honesty. My certainties scattered. My blood felt frozen. This was no ordinary deception. It read like the record of a fiendish, deliberate design. Sweeping aside the freezing paralysis that had gripped me, driven by that merciless urge to know, I forced my thumb beneath the stiff first page and turned it slowly, the dry rasp sounding like something being unsealed after a long burial. My mind supplied a litany of horrors I might find next. Breathing became difficult. But the second page offered not a confession, not a lament, but something far colder, a ledger. In the same careful female hand, columns of entries unfolded, neat, methodical, as precise as an accountant's book. It was not a diary, but an operational record. Reading that list, my eyes darted over the left-hand column to see dates so old they predated my existence. And along the right-hand side were terse, clinical notations. Parcel 7, Box 3, Caravan departed, carrier changed. The language was military, administrative, coded, as if cataloging cargo in a clandestine network. I felt sick with the realization this was not a personal memoir, but the minutes of a crime, an operation, perhaps a smuggling ring. In disbelief, as if the cellar's poisoned air might be tricking me, I began to turn pages faster, 3, 5 at a time, driven by that rage and fear. Each page offered the same merciless truth. The book was filled, page after page, with the same clinical lists. It mapped an enterprise in which my dear, honest Henry had apparently been involved long before I ever knew him. The scale of it, dozens, perhaps hundreds of entries, hammered into me with a cold, relentless certainty.
My fingers, traveling numbly through the cold, mechanical pages of that soulless ledger, suddenly struck something alien. A faint rise between the damp sheets, a smooth, unnatural firmness that jarred against the paper's rough texture. For a heartbeat, I froze, as though I had touched ice. Something had been hidden there, not by chance, but with intent. Unlike the sterile, coded lists that filled the rest of the book, this object, thin, sharp-edged, the shape of a folded note, felt deliberate, human. I knew, before I even drew it out, that it did not belong to the mysterious woman whose hand had filled the ledger. It felt different. It felt like him, Henry, my Henry, as though he had slipped this fragment into the book himself, a message, an admission, a key buried in the heart of a crime. For a moment, I forgot the oppressive weight of the diary in my lap. I slid the fragile thing out from between the pages with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic, holding it as delicately as a moth's wing. The paper, yellowed and brittle, had been folded into a small, perfect square. My hands trembled violently as I held it. My heart beat louder now than when I had first opened the book. Holding my breath, I began to unfold it, one layer at a time, careful not to tear the fragile seams, as though even the ink might vanish if exposed too quickly to the air. When the torchlight finally fell upon its crumpled surface, I saw not the elegant, pearl-like script of the unknown woman, but the coarse, hurried handwriting I knew better than my own reflection. Henry's hand,
the uneven loops, the impatient lines, unmistakable. In his clumsy, familiar script, scrawled upon that yellow square, were just 2 words, ink-blotted, blurred by moisture, yet still perfectly legible. 2 words addressed to her, the woman whose voice filled the rest of the book. 2 words that froze my blood more completely than anything before them. Be patient. I stared at them, at those 2 plain, unassuming words, and felt the ground shift beneath me. This was Henry's writing, his hand, his tone. My husband, the man I had trusted, loved, and shared 50 years with, and here, folded and hidden in the heart of another woman's coded ledger, was his command to wait. For what? For whom? It wasn't shock I felt, nor even confusion. It was a slow, spreading paralysis, the numbing, surgical pain of betrayal. I was touching the proof of something vast, something that had begun long before I ever existed. My husband's life had not begun with me. It had roots elsewhere, in another secret, another woman, another world buried beneath our home. My mind reeled between the 2 handwritings, Henry's crude scrawl and her meticulous calligraphy, trying and failing to comprehend how they could belong to the same story. What bound them? What exchange? What entrusted item? What could he have told her to be patient for? My thoughts swung helplessly between them, as if caught in a pendulum of madness. Henry's intrusion into that alien text, his hand, his words, turned the entire chest upside down. The book was no longer a stranger's relic. It was his. Every ribboned bundle, every yellowed note, every list and symbol, they all became extensions of Henry's will, fragments of a shadow life he had woven long before mine. In that tomb-like cellar, surrounded by the echo of my own breathing, I sat frozen, clutching the tiny note in my hand. For the first time in 82 years, I felt utterly alone, not widowed, but orphaned from my own history. The man I had loved had buried another life beneath our house and allowed me to live unknowingly upon its grave. Whoever that note had been meant for, those words, "Be patient," had now stripped me of all patience of my own. Whatever this exchange had been, whatever entrusted thing they had guarded together, I had to know. No longer out of curiosity, but out of survival, out of the need to salvage whatever remained of my dignity. This was no longer about understanding Henry. It was about unearthing the truth before it buried me with him.
As I clenched that slip of paper, Henry's cold 2-word command, "Be patient," in my trembling hand, I felt as though he were there with me in that damp cellar, not speaking to that woman, but to me, mocking me, taunting me from beyond the grave. Rage, grief, and disbelief coiled together inside me as I forced myself to focus, to keep what little sense I still possessed.
My fingers, shaken with dread, turned the next page of the cursed ledger, the page marked by his deceitful note. But when the flickering beam of the torch fell upon the new sheet, I was met not with more of the coded lists, no more box 3 or parcel 7 or carrier replaced, but with something infinitely worse. There, in that same graceful hand, stood a single line, one final sentence, written hastily, unevenly, as though the woman's hand had trembled in terror, the ink smudged and breaking, and beneath it, an expanse of pure white silence, stretching across the rest of the page and the pages beyond. I read the words aloud in a whisper that died in the stale air. Last caravan, the entrusted item is lost. Those final words, the entrusted item is lost, struck me like a cry echoing through the stone walls. In that instant, I understood. Henry's warning, his plea for patience, had failed. Whatever this exchange had been, whatever item they guarded, it had ended in catastrophe. The ledger, all those lists and codes, culminated here, in failure, in loss, a tragedy. And the blankness that followed, that vast, unbearable whiteness consuming every page thereafter, was like an eternal pause. It told me that the story ended there, abruptly, forever sealed. Whatever had happened, the woman had not written another word. Her hand had stopped. The book that I had hoped might explain Henry's secret instead handed me a void, a white abyss filled not with answers, but with silence. It was as though the truth itself had been swallowed whole. A suffocating wave of hopelessness swept over me, heavier than the damp air of the cellar. I realized with a cold clarity that this thick, leather-bound journal held no revelations, only riddles too vast to solve. The lost, entrusted item. The last caravan. Words that meant everything and nothing, their meaning buried in a grave I could never unearth. My eyes drifted from the blank pages to the darkness within the chest, to what remained, the things I had almost forgotten in my obsession with the book. The torchlight slid across the bottom, revealing something softer, almost tender by contrast. Neat stacks of yellowed papers bound with faded ribbons, pink and blue, their colors ghostly pale with age. For the first time since I had opened the chest, something in me stirred. Not terror this time, but a faint, fragile hope. Letters, perhaps. Something human, something that might speak of feeling rather than calculation. I let out a trembling breath and set the heavy ledger down. It landed softly on the damp soil, returning to the darkness where it belonged, my anger and disappointment drained with the motion. Turning my full attention to the pale bundle tied with a delicate blue ribbon, so fragile it seemed to quiver beneath the torchlight, I reached out, my hand unsteady. The paper looked as if it might crumble at the lightest touch, and yet I could not stop myself. Whatever waited beneath that ribbon, I knew it would be different. Not a code, not an order. Perhaps at last, something human. Something that might whisper who she was, or what had been lost. Slowly, fear and yearning entwined, I let my fingertips rest upon the cool paper surface and began to lift.
In my hands, the bundle of papers tied with that faded blue ribbon felt like the very opposite of the dark, soulless ledger I had cast aside moments earlier. It carried a strange warmth, fragile, human, almost tender, as though it held not a secret, but a memory soaked in tears. Yet even that gentle ribbon, pale and delicate as it was, belonged to the same cursed chest, to the same shadow my late husband Henry had buried. The small flicker of hope it stirred in me was already poisoned by fear. My fingers, stiff with age and damp, worked clumsily at the knot. The ribbon had hardened with time, its threads fused together by the cellar's merciless humidity. Each second I spent trying to unpick it filled me with a deeper dread. This fragile seal, this soft knot, resisted me more stubbornly than the lock of the great chest itself. It felt as though whatever lay beneath those pages was protected not by metal, but by will. At last the ribbon gave way, splintering, fraying apart like something dying, and its limp remains fell into the soil. What remained was a loose pile of yellowed pages, their edges curled and stiffened by moisture. I held my breath, staring down at the topmost sheet, waiting for the next calamity to surface. With a trembling finger, I lifted the uppermost paper, thicker than the rest, almost like card, and tilted it toward the torchlight. What gleamed back at me was not a letter, nor a note, nor another list. It was a photograph. Its surface, dulled by time, reflected the light unevenly. The white serrated borders betrayed its age. Chemical stains marred the image, ghosting it with indistinct shapes. I narrowed my eyes, bringing the torch closer. The photographs showed no house, no landscape, but a baby. A small infant wrapped in a lace-edged blanket, cradled in unseen arms. The figure holding the child was obscured, faceless in the dim light, yet the child itself, that still, spectral face, was unmistakable. It was the entrusted thing, the lost one. The word that had haunted every page of the ledger now had a face. Small, innocent, human. The realization struck like a blow. Whatever my husband's secret had been, it was not a matter of money, nor smuggling, nor theft. It was a life, a tiny, vanished life. In a daze, I began to shuffle through the rest of the bundle, driven by a feverish hope that somewhere among them might be a name, an explanation, a trace of mercy. But the torchlight revealed nothing of the kind. Each photograph was the same. One after another, the same baby, in different poses, in the same sterile light. No mother. No smile, not even a note on the back. Just that silent child, captured over and over, as if for documentation rather than remembrance. They were not keepsakes, they were records, proofs. By the time I had reached the last of them, my hands were shaking too violently to hold the stack. It slipped, scattering across my lap like pale ghosts. I stared at them, dozens of tiny witnesses, each bearing the same nameless, accusing face, and understood that I was cradling not memories, but
evidence. The blue-ribboned bundle had given me no answers, only a grief too heavy to name. My eyes, stung with tears, turned slowly toward the bottom of the chest, toward the final tile I had not yet touched. It waited in the torchlight, bound with a faint, faded pink ribbon, soft, innocent, and dreadful in its quiet patience.
As I laid the pale, ghostly portraits of that nameless child upon the damp earth beside me, unable to bear their silent accusation any longer, what I felt was not terror now, but a searing, restless curiosity. For at the bottom of the chest, still half caught in the wavering gleam of my torch, there remained one last bundle, the final secret that had not yet met the air. Unlike the cold, clinical blue ribbon that had bound the photographs, this one seemed softer, more personal, a dirty shade of pink, faded but still clinging to a trace of innocence. I stared at it, and in that fragile color I saw my final hope. Perhaps this held not a code, nor an account, but a confession, perhaps her confession, the story of the lost, entrusted thing. I reached down into the chill of the chest once more. The paper beneath my fingertips felt different, lighter, finer, and as I lifted it into my lap, the pink ribbon, stiff with damp, resisted me with stubborn strength. My nails tore at the knot impatiently, desperate to know, terrified to know. At last the ribbon gave way, snapping apart with a dry sigh, and the bundle loosened in my hands. The top sheet was not a photograph. It was a letter. The paper was thin and delicate, the kind once chosen for love rather than business. And across it, in that same graceful, meticulous handwriting I had seen in the ledger, ran lines of dark ink, close and unbroken, filling the page. I leaned forward, breath caught in my throat. This was no list, no record, no cipher. This was a voice, and the first name it spoke, written again and again, was Henry. The torchlight trembled as I focused on the opening line, on the words that revealed the heart and purpose of the letter. They were written with care, pressed deep into the paper as if by a trembling hand, the ink blurred where a tear might once have fallen. And there, in the wavering light of the cellar, I read them, "My dearest Henry," and beneath it the phrase that pierced like a blade, "The sole owner of my soul." The cold of the cellar vanished. What I felt then was not chill, but fire, the scorching, blinding fire of betrayal. It was not a message of business or conspiracy. It was love, pure, unashamed, burning love, written to the man I had adored, the man I had trusted, the man whose life I believed had begun with me. This was no transaction, no exchange, no sterile partnership. It was a declaration, a vow, proof that long before I had entered his world, Henry had belonged entirely to another woman. For 82 years, I had thought myself the first, the only, and now I saw with unbearable clarity that I had always been the second. Through the blur of tears freezing on my cheeks, I devoured the rest of the page, desperate, furious, broken. And then I saw it, the word entrusted. There, amid the delicate loops of her script, stood the phrases,
Our child is well, isn't she? And please, Henry, protect our daughter." The truth landed like a hammer blow. Every fragment, the ledger, the blue ribbon, the spectral photographs fused together into one monstrous revelation. The entrusted item, the lost parcel, the nameless infant in the faded photographs. It was no object, no artifact, no secret consignment. It was a child, their child, Henry's and hers. A little girl, the daughter of the man I had loved and the woman who called him the owner of her soul. And I, Nora, had lived a lifetime over the grave of that truth, unknowing, unchosen, and deceived.
In my lap, in my trembling hands, the pink-ribboned bundle of papers no longer felt like a mere collection of letters steeped in betrayal. It had become something far heavier, the first shattering pages of a hidden life, the life of a lost child I had never known existed, a child who carried Henry's blood. The word daughter froze my veins more completely than the cellar's cold ever could. No longer with my fingers, but with my very soul, I tore through the remaining letters, their surfaces rippled, perhaps by tears long dried. Beneath the torch's flicker, I read each one in breathless terror, turning the pages faster and faster, sensing that I was racing toward an inevitable end. Each page cried out with the same elegant hand, but the tone shifted, from passion to pleading, from love to panic. The woman's words, once composed and adoring, became fevered, uneven, splashed with blotches of smeared ink. She begged Henry to act, to save their child. The people hiding the little girl had been discovered, she wrote. The child was no longer safe. He must intervene at once. The last caravan, she said, the same phrase from the ledger, is her only chance. My mind flicked back to the heavy coded journal lying in the soil beside me, to its final entry, "The entrusted item is lost." When I looked again at the date scrawled beneath that entry, it aligned with an awful precision to the date on the woman's last letter. The same day, the same hour, the same tragedy. At the very bottom of the pink ribbon stack, I found a fragment, not a letter, but a torn scrap, its edges scorched, the ink half melted into the paper. And there, in the ghost of her graceful handwriting, I made out the final broken words. "The caravan has gone, Henry. Our daughter didn't come. The owner of your soul has lost hers." In that moment, I understood it all. Henry had not merely betrayed me, he had failed them. The chest was not a vault of secrets, but a tomb, a grave for his guilt, his lost child, his lost love, a monument to the life he could not save. In my lap lay the relics of that life, the cold, coded ledger, the photographs of the nameless child, the tear-stained letters of the woman who had once owned my husband's heart. They were the pieces of a tragedy buried beneath the foundation of our marriage, beneath the very floor of this house where I had thought myself safe. Lifting the torch once more, I shined it into the bottom of the chest, desperate for something, any small fragment that might contradict what I had learned. But there was nothing left, only rotted wood, a scatter of earth, and an endless dark hollow where meaning had once been. And there, in that freezing cellar, surrounded by the remains of another woman's life, I understood, with a clarity that seared through me, that my own 82 years had been built upon a lie. The 50 years I had shared with Henry, the tender routines, the quiet love, the faith I had carried, all of it had been constructed upon the grave of his first love and their lost child. I had lived beside a man whose heart, whose very soul had died long before I met him. Henry had not buried a secret in this chest. He had buried himself. The woman's final words had been true. The owner of his soul had lost it, and he had entombed that loss here, his love, his daughter, his ruin, sealing it beneath the weight of our home and living out the rest of his days in the shadow of that silence. I realized then that my husband, the kind, honest, faithful man I had wept for, had died twice. Once long ago in this cellar when he sealed away his child and his soul, and again last year in our bed beside me, crushed beneath the burden of a grief I had never been allowed to see. And I, poor fool that I am, had only mourned the second death.
Alone now in that icy cellar, with the truth burning colder than the damp air around me, I found myself surrounded by the wreckage of a 50-year lie, ornate, tender, and unforgiving. My fingers, which only moments before had torn through these relics with anger and desperation, began to move with a strange funeral calm. I gathered them one by one, as though performing a burial rite. First, I returned the pink-ribboned letters, the cries of the woman who had called herself the owner of my husband's soul, to their resting place inside the wooden chest. Then, with shaking hands, I laid the pale, emotionless portraits of the lost child upon them, uniting the two faces of the same tragedy, the burning passion of the mother and the frozen innocence of the daughter. My eyes fell next upon the ledger, the cold, methodical record of disaster. I opened it one final time and stared at the trembling entry. The entrusted item is lost, and the endless white silence that followed. It was no longer a mystery to me, but a verdict, the death certificate of a dream. Henry and the woman who had kept this record had not merely lost a child, they had lost the future itself. In my palm still lay the crumpled scrap of paper, Henry's 2-word message, "Be patient." I placed it carefully back between the pages, in the exact spot where I had found it, just before the catastrophe. Then I closed the heavy leather cover, sealing the book and its ghosts, and laid it atop the letters and photographs, the final layer of this quiet grave. At last I reached for the velvet cloth, the one I had thrown aside at the beginning, heavy with dust and moth scent, the shroud of the past. Lifting it gently from the damp soil, I spread it once more over the contents of the chest.
My hands trembled as I smoothed it down, knowing I was burying not just the relics of another life, but Henry's soul itself. When I lowered the wooden lid, the cellar filled with the slow, aching cry of the hinges, a dirge of rust and sorrow. The lid fell shut with a hollow, final thud that reverberated through the air. It was not merely the sound of wood striking wood. It was the last nail driven into the coffin of my marriage, of my imagined faithful home. Beside me, half buried in the earth, lay the old padlock, the same heavy iron that had once guarded this secret. I picked it up. Its cold metal burned my palm. I turned it over in my hand, staring at it blankly as though its meaning might somehow return. When I hooked it once more through the corroded clasp, I did not do it to secure anything. There was nothing left to protect. This was only a ritual, a mark to say that the grave had been found, opened, and that its poison had passed into me. I was now its keeper, the living custodian of the dead. And so I remained there, the useless padlock before me, the ornate key still clenched in my other hand, the cursed inheritance of my husband's hidden life. In that damp, silent cellar, among the ruins of a love I had thought pure, I sat alone, holding the symbol of a door that would never open again, and realizing, at last, that Henry had left me not a secret, but a haunting.
With my knees aching, not merely from the rheumatism that 82 years of life had carved into them, but from the unbearable weight of what I had just learned, I braced myself against the cold, damp wall and rose, inch by inch. The pain in my joints, the trembling in my bones, all vanished beneath the far heavier pain that now filled my chest. When at last I stood upright, steadying myself, I turned one final time toward the far corner of the cellar, toward the wooden heap that no longer seemed a chest to me, but a grave. It was the sealed tomb of my husband's soul, of the woman he had loved, and of the child he had failed to save. I knew then that I alone was its living keeper, the last guardian of their silence, and that I would carry this burden until my own end. In my palm, still cold and heavy, lay the ornate iron key, the key that had opened the gates of this small hell and revealed the wreckage of my husband's hidden life. I did not yet know what to do with it. Should I hide it once more in the wall's dark hollow, or keep it by my side as a relic of my punishment, a weight I had earned? My thoughts were blurred, my will dissolved. There was nothing left for the chest to tell me. Its whispers were spent. I turned my back upon it with the slow, deliberate resolve of someone leaving a grave behind, carrying with me the full guilt of its secret, its sorrow, its unspoken sin. The key I kept clenched in my hand, as one might grip a shard of pain to remind oneself of what must never be forgotten. I raised the trembling beam of my torch from the dark corner and turned it toward the stairs. The same damp, creaking steps that had brought me into this pit now seemed absurdly trivial, a meaningless accident that had torn open the fabric of my life. I smiled bitterly and began to climb toward the faint light above, toward the cold brightness of my new hollow world. When I reached the top, I closed the heavy wooden door behind me, not merely on the cellar, but on Henry's soul, his betrayal, and the sorrow of the child he had lost. The hinges moaned like the last breath of something ancient, and the door settled shut with a dull, resonant thud. That sound, echoing through the quiet house, was not just wood upon wood. It was the final nail driven into the coffin of my marriage. On the damp earth beside me lay the old padlock, the iron symbol of Henry's deceit. I picked it up. Its cold surface stung my skin, and I turned it over in my hand, staring without purpose. When I looped it once more through the corroded clasp, it was not to protect the chest. Nothing remained to guard. It was a ritual act, a seal of acknowledgement. I had found the grave, opened it, absorbed its poison, and now I alone was its sentinel. The chest lay silent, locked without a key, and in my other hand I still held the ornate iron that had damned me, Henry's last tangible legacy. I stood amid the ruins of our life, unsure of what to do, alone but alive in the echo of the dead. The flickering torch dimmed as I stepped back into the kitchen, the room where I had spent half a century of what I had believed was happiness. The pale lamplight revealed every familiar detail, the table, the chairs, the window looking out onto the garden, yet all of it now seemed foreign, staged, false. My home had been built upon a grave, and I had mistaken its silence for peace. Looking down at the key still burning in my palm, I knew I would never hide it again. Henry had buried his secret beneath the house, but I would not. I would keep the key where I could see it, in my bedside drawer, beside my own beating heart, a weight I would carry for the rest of my days. The ceiling leak still dripped faintly into the bucket, a small rhythmic sound that now meant nothing. There were no repairs left to make, no storms left to fear. My only task now was to live as the sole witness of the ruin my husband left behind, to guard both his name and my own memory, to preserve our shared lie in silence until my final breath. I had once wondered what Henry had hidden in that chest, a fortune, a secret, a confession. I had found none of those things. What I found instead were his ghosts, the soul he lost, the daughter he could not save, and the ashes of a happiness that had never been real. And that, the heaviest truth of all, would remain mine alone until the day I joined them in the dark.